Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths, legends, and ancient stories are told slowly and softly to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now, settle in, relax, and allow tonight's bedtime story carry you into sleep.
Meet Hercules, the most famous demigod in history and quite possibly the least emotionally stable. You probably know him from the Disney movie, where he's charming, noble, and mostly clothed. The real story, less charming, more homicide. Hercules was born from divine adultery, driven mad by a vengeful goddess, and sentenced to 12 impossible tasks. Let's dive in to the real story of Hercules. Messy, tragic, and nowhere near appropriate for Saturday morning cartoons. Before he was known as a muscle-bound folk hero, part-time god, and full-time problem, Hercules was simply the unfortunate result of divine meddling and bad decision-making. His Greek name was Heracles, which roughly translates to glory of Hera, a choice that was either deeply ironic or an ancient attempt at gaslighting. For the sake of recognizability, and because most people associate Heracles with pharmaceutical side effects, we'll refer to him as Hercules from this point forward. Like all catastrophes of legendary proportions, his story begins with Zeus, king of the gods, thunder hurler, Olympian monarch, and most notably, the universe's least discreet philanderer. Zeus had many hobbies, creating storms, flexing on mortals, enforcing questionable moral standards. But his favourite pastime by far was fathering children he had no intention of raising, usually through methods that would make a modern ethics board spontaneously combust. Enter Alcmene, a mortal woman of great beauty, intelligence, and, most relevantly, married status. Alcmene was the wife of Amphitryon, a perfectly respectable general who had made the strategic error of leaving her alone for long enough for Zeus to swoop in. And by swoop in, we of course mean disguise himself as Amphitryon and spend the night impersonating her husband. Because identity theft was apparently a divine loophole with no consequences in the ancient world. Zeus, never one to half commit to deceit, even extended the night to 3 times its normal length to make the most of the impersonation. Time manipulation, just another perk of godhood. To recap, mortal woman, uninvited immortal impersonation, temporally elongated seduction, the kind of origin story that raises more eyebrows than it inspires odes. Alcmene eventually figured out that something wasn't quite right. Perhaps it was the divine glow, the suspicious weather patterns, or the fact that the real Amphitryon came home looking very confused. But by then, the damage had been done. Or rather, the fetus had been conceived. In fact, 2 fetuses had. Alcmene gave birth to twins, Iphicles, son of Amphitryon, and Hercules, son of a thunderbolt-happy god with no self-restraint. It was the ancient equivalent of a paternity reveal gone wildly out of hand. Now, if Hercules had been born into a quiet, forgiving world, perhaps things might have turned out differently. But he wasn't. He was born into a divine soap opera, where the queen of the gods, Hera, had a standing policy of vengeance toward anyone her husband so much as looked at. Hera wife of Zeus, was less goddess of marriage and more celestial retribution specialist. To her credit, she was reacting to years, centuries really, of Zeus behaving like the world's most powerful Tinder user. But instead of confronting him, she did what all reasonable mortals do. She took it out on the women and children involved. Hercules, who had done absolutely nothing besides exist, found himself squarely in Hera's celestial crosshairs. You might be wondering why a newborn was seen as a threat. Perhaps because he glowed a little, or because prophecy stated he'd be great, or more likely because Hera had a divine grudge to feed and limited options for therapy. To begin her campaign of passive-aggressive smiting, Hera delayed Hercules' birth just long enough for another, less exciting child, Eurystheus, to be born first. This ensured that Eurystheus would be king, and Hercules would grow up with a permanent sense of existential injustice. It was petty, strategic, and surprisingly effective. Unfortunately for everyone involved, it was just the beginning. Hera's next move was to send 2 snakes into baby Hercules' crib while he was still in swaddling clothes. Subtlety was not her strong suit. Most babies cry when they see a snake. Hercules, having inherited Zeus's violent instincts and none of his discretion, simply grabbed the snakes and strangled them. It was his first act of violence, and it wouldn't be his last. Also, it made baby-proofing the palace completely pointless. Despite this deeply unsettling display of infantile strength, Hercules was raised as a mortal, though one who could probably bench press a horse by age 5. He received a traditional noble education: music, archery, chariot driving, and occasional rage management. His early years were filled with attempts to channel his strength into respectable outlets, none of which ended particularly well. Music, for instance, was supposed to cultivate refinement. He was handed a lyre and taught by a well-meaning music instructor named Linus, who believed that art could soothe even the most turbulent soul. This theory was, in retrospect, untested. When Hercules missed a note and received some gentle correction, he responded in the way only a future mythic hero could, by hitting Linus over the head with the instrument, fatally, thus ending both the music lesson and Linus's earthly tenure. From that point on, people stopped giving Hercules instruments and started giving him very wide personal space. It's unclear whether this was a turning point in his education, or simply when everyone involved decided to pivot from refined nobleman to just keep him pointed away from the city. If his early years seem unpromising in terms of moral development, that's because they were. Hercules didn't learn lessons so much as he brute forced his way through them. Discipline didn't stick. Guidance didn't stick. Weapons, unfortunately, did. He matured into a towering man, broad-shouldered, big-hearted, in the cardiac sense, and wildly unqualified for any role that involved nuance. While others cultivated philosophy or politics, Hercules leaned into smashing things. He was the original strongman cliché, too powerful for his own good, with a temper that could level architecture and a moral compass that occasionally spun like a broken weather vane. Still, people admired him. Admiration in ancient times was less about ethics and more about whether you could slay something with teeth. Hercules, it turned out, could slay everything with teeth. He also looked fantastic shirtless, which, in mythological PR, counted for at least as much as civic responsibility. Of course, being admired didn't stop people from fearing him, and it certainly didn't prevent more divine interference. Hera, having watched him grow into a human battering ram, decided that the best way to prevent him from achieving true greatness was to make him go mad. Again, subtlety was not her forte. Driven into a temporary frenzy, courtesy of divine mental manipulation, which was apparently legal at the time, Hercules did the unthinkable. He killed his wife, Megara, and their children. Not in battle, not in defense, but in a blind, furious episode of God-induced rage. It was a horrific act, made even worse by the fact that he loved them. When he recovered his senses, he was devastated. And yet, because this was Greek mythology, the solution wasn't therapy or time off. It was punishment, ritual cleansing, a series of tasks designed by committee with all the compassion of a tax audit. But that's not this part of the story. That comes next. This part is about origins, about divine interference masquerading as destiny, about a man born into chaos, raised in confusion, and trained in precisely the wrong set of skills for someone trying to lead a peaceful life. It's about a system that rewarded strength over wisdom, reaction over reflection, and spectacle over sense. Hercules didn't become a legend because he was virtuous. He became a legend because the gods, in their infinite bureaucracy, kept throwing him into increasingly absurd situations, and he somehow survived. His life was less a journey of self-discovery, and more a prolonged mythological hazard course, sponsored by trauma and divine favoritism. And it all began with a thunderbolt, a lie, and a baby who strangled serpents like they were teething toys. 12 labours and one overworked demigod. After his brief but memorable stint as a child who could strangle serpents with a casual grip, Hercules' life took a truly unexpected turn. It's not that he was looking for redemption, it's more that redemption looked like an unpaid internship that required killing a series of increasingly mythical creatures. Thanks again, Hera. After the whole accidentally murdering his wife and kids debacle, again, not his fault, Hercules was given the charming task of performing 12 labours. These were, as the gods put it, a path to atonement, though from the way things went down, it was more like a cosmic insurance policy to keep the demigod occupied and out of Hera's immediate line of sight. So instead of receiving the divine intervention of a nice, peaceful life where he could pursue therapy, creative hobbies, or maybe work on a few ethical flaws, Hercules was sent off on a series of tasks that would have sent any other mortal straight into an early retirement. Let's review, shall we? And by review, I mean laugh at the sheer impracticality of it all. Labour number 1, slay the Nemean lion. It's hard to say whether this labour was designed for Hercules' benefit or Hera's, but either way, it's about as useful as sending someone to fight a house cat with nothing but their bare hands. The Nemean lion was a beast so ferocious that normal weapons, like spears or arrows, did absolutely nothing. No, this lion had fur tougher than the most stubborn of Greek olive trees, and none of the mortal weapons would leave a scratch. So, what did Hercules do? Well, he did the only thing that made sense. He went full primal. He wrestled the lion to the ground, strangled it, and then used its own claws to skin it. Sure, it was an impressive display of strength, But this was no character development. It was just the world's most dangerous game of who can hold on longest to a cat that could eat them whole. At least he got a cool pelt out of it, which I suppose is what most people look for in a career path: fashion and fury. Labour number 2. Slay the 9-headed Linnaean Hydra. Next on the list was the Hydra. The Hydra, for those unfamiliar, was a multi-headed monster. And the beauty of this creature was that whenever you chopped off one head, 2 more grew in its place. This is the ancient Greek version of trying to fix a broken sink by installing a new faucet that only makes the problem worse. So how did Hercules handle it? By using his trusty weapon of choice, a sword, and hacking away at the heads like a man possessed by extreme frustration. Eventually he realised that hacking at the heads was only fueling the Hydra's bad behaviour. So he called for backup and got his nephew, Iolaus, to burn the stumps as he chopped the heads off, ensuring no regrowth. It was a labour that could have been solved with a simple online tutorial about multitasking, but instead it was turned into a supernatural drama with a lot of gratuitous bloodshed. Labour number 3. Capture the golden hind of Artemis. On to the next task, which involved the very graceful and speedy golden hind of Artemis. Hercules' job? Catch it. This was supposed to be an epic feat of stamina, agility, and sheer determination. But let's be real, this was just a glorified chase sequence. The hind wasn't a demon, it wasn't trying to kill him, it was just trying to mind its business. But alas, Hercules was a demigod with something to prove, so he spent a year chasing the poor animal around. Eventually, he cornered it. Artemis, understandably, wasn't thrilled that one of her sacred creatures had been captured, and Hercules, being the ever-persistent hero, simply explained that he was doing his job and couldn't be bothered to consider the ethical implications of chasing a frightened deer. In the end, he had to let it go, because naturally that's how rescue missions work when you're under contract. Labour number 4. Capture the Erymanthian boar. This one was straightforward. Catch a giant boar. Not slay, mind you, just catch. Sure, boars are dangerous, especially when you're a demigod with a short temper, but the solution here was relatively simple. Find the boar, trap it, and bring it back. Hercules did what any logical person would do. Chased the boar through snow until it was tired, then caught it. The problem wasn't the boar. It was the fact that Hercules, with all his divine abilities, was given this to do. For someone who'd strangled a lion and fought off a hydra, this task was like asking a world-class chef to boil an egg. But hey, he brought back the boar, so there's that. Labour number 5. Clean the Augean stables. Ah, the Augean stables. This one is truly the pièce de résistance of impossible tasks, not because it involved any mythical creatures or death-defying feats, but because it was essentially a glorified cleaning job. Hercules was tasked with cleaning the Augean stables, which housed an absurd number of cattle and had not been cleaned in decades. The manure had piled up to such heights that it was less of a stable and more of a small-scale environmental disaster. Normally, a simple shovel and a few hours would have sufficed, but instead, Hercules, in a moment of inspired laziness, decided to divert 2 rivers to wash out the filth. Naturally, this was an excessively over-engineered solution to a problem that could have been solved with an industrial-sized broom. It took him a day, and the task was complete, but the entire thing was such an absurd overreaction that we can only assume someone on the gods' council was laughing their celestial behind off. Labour number 6. Slay the Stymphalian birds. Now things started to escalate. The Stymphalian birds were aggressive, metallic creatures that lived near a lake and had the curious habit of launching their own feathers like arrows. So, what does Hercules do? He takes a giant rattle, thanks for that, Athena, shakes it until the birds are startled, and then shoots them down. This task involved little more than intimidation and mechanical birds. It was practically an early version of pest control. The birds didn't stand a chance, mainly because Hercules was armed with a weapon that could have been used in a different life as a DIY lawnmower. Labour number 7. Capture the Cretan bull. This was a bull with a penchant for rampaging, which, if you think about it, is exactly the kind of creature that should not be tasked to a demigod already juggling lion slaying and river diverting duties. Hercules went to Crete, wrangled the bull with impressive strength, and then brought it back. And this was considered a feat. But honestly, capturing a bull isn't exactly the level of trial you'd expect for someone who had been outsmarting hydras and winning battles against monsters with an entire arsenal of divine powers. The bull, for all its strength, was still just a bull. Labour number 8. Steal the mares of Diomedes. The mares of Diomedes were famously aggressive and had been fed human flesh. You'd think that would be an obvious hint to avoid them, but no. Hercules was tasked with stealing these flesh-eating horses. Of course, he handled it by feeding Diomedes to his own horses. Yes, that's right, more human flesh for the horses. Then calmly walking off with the beasts. So, this was one of those rare moments when the hero actually becomes the villain in the process. Labour number 9. Obtain the girdle of Hippolyta. The girdle of Hippolyta was a gift from Ares to the queen of the Amazons, so naturally Hercules was sent to obtain it. This task was supposed to involve diplomacy, but instead it devolved into a full-on battle. In true Hercules style, he solved the problem by fighting his way to victory, not realising that a simple conversation with Hippolyta could have spared him all the violence. Labour number 10. Capture the cattle of Geryon. At this point, it's safe to say that Hercules was really questioning his life choices. To capture the cattle of Geryon, a three-bodied monster, Hercules had to fight not just one, but 3 of him at the same time. This labour involved a fair amount of bloodshed, and honestly was probably only doable because it was somehow easier than managing the bureaucratic hellscape that was his day-to-day life. Labour number 11. Steal the apples of the Hesperides. These apples, guarded by a dragon, were the stuff of legend. Hercules was tasked with stealing them. In the end, he got help from Atlas, who was holding up the sky, but no matter. Hercules did what Hercules does best, smashed things, obtained things, and still got the short end of the stick in terms of fame. Labour number 12. Capture Cerberus. The final labour involved capturing Cerberus, the 3-headed dog guarding the underworld. No big deal. Just go to the underworld, subdue a hellhound, and bring it back. This would have been the perfect final task for Hercules, because it summed up his entire career. Ridiculous, dangerous, and not actually in any way redeeming. Love life and other natural disasters. Ah, love. For Hercules, it was less the heart-warming, romantic saga one might expect from a hero, and more the ancient Greek equivalent of a poorly organised reality show where every romantic gesture was followed by an incredibly messy breakup and a bloody aftermath. If there's one thing that could be said about Hercules' love life, it's that it had more twists and turns than a labyrinth designed by someone who had never read the concept of boundaries. First, let's talk about Megara. Our Megara, the original Megara, not the snarky, wisecracking, Disneyized version who managed to make a deal with Hades just to get out of a mildly uncomfortable situation. No, this Megara was a tragic figure, as were most of Hercules' significant others. You see, Hercules met her when he was feeling all heroic and purpose-driven, as he so often did between a series of egregious life errors. They fell in love, got married, and by all accounts were quite happy for a time. Unfortunately, Hera wasn't having any of it. In case you've missed the memo, Hera had a tendency to ruin Hercules' life at every turn, often with no more reasoning than, "I am the queen of the gods, and I'm bored." So, Hera, being the loving stepmother that she was, decided to have some fun with Hercules and make him go mad. In his frenzied state, Hercules tragically murdered his wife Megara and their children. Yes, you read that right. A moment of complete, soul-crushing madness brought on by divine interference. Hercules, fully intending to be a loving husband and father, ended up the unwitting destroyer of his family. If you're wondering why this wasn't adapted into a Disney movie, just imagine the post-credit scene. Hercules coming to terms with his crime, and the filmmakers trying to make that a teachable moment for children. Just imagine. From there, Hercules' love life turned into a tragic comedy of errors, which was honestly just an extension of his entire existence. His next major love interest was Iola, who had the unfortunate fate of being caught in Hercules' orbit. He was, of course, smitten with her, because why wouldn't he be? She was beautiful, and when you're Hercules, you fall in love with anything that isn't actively trying to kill you. Unfortunately, his romantic pursuits often came with baggage, not of the emotional sort, but of the highly dramatic, "I'm not allowed to date anyone unless things get really complicated" variety. Naturally, Hera had to get involved again, and while Hercules was busy battling monsters and saving kingdoms, Hera was busy turning his personal life into a soap opera. Iole, tragically, never stood a chance. She was caught up in the middle of his grand emotional mess. And soon enough, Hercules found himself tangled in yet another ill-fated relationship that he thought was perfect. This relationship didn't end in violent tragedy, but the whole thing was about as realistic as trying to build a sandcastle during a hurricane. As we'll see, this wasn't even his most absurd romantic misadventure. Then came Omphale. Omphale was a queen, which meant she was more than capable of holding her own in a world dominated by insufferable gods and tragic heroes. So when she had the opportunity to take Hercules on as a slave, and yes, you read that correctly, she didn't hesitate. For a period, Hercules was at her service, a grown man who found himself enslaved to a woman who, to put it delicately, was about as unbothered by his status as she was by his legendary strength. In fact, Omphale took full advantage of her newfound power over the demigod. The whole thing was less a romance and more a strange internship, where Hercules, the man who killed monsters for a living, found himself serving as a slave and wearing women's clothing as part of his duties. The whole ordeal is an excellent example of what happens when your romantic life turns into a passive-aggressive power play. The ancient Greeks would have called it character development. The rest of us would call it a huge mistake. But Hercules wasn't finished with his love life, oh no. He still had time for more relationship misadventures. And so we come to Deianira, the woman who was almost his salvation, and yet also absolutely not his salvation. Deianira was a more conventional match for Hercules, or at least she seemed so at first. She was beautiful, noble, and, perhaps most importantly, willing to marry him. It started off simply enough. They got married, had a couple of kids, and for a brief moment, Hercules got to experience a semblance of normalcy. But as we've seen before, normal and Hercules rarely exist in the same sentence for more than 5 minutes. Enter the poisoned shirt. Yes, this is how things went down. There's no sugarcoating it. Hercules, ever the tragic figure, was off on some adventure when Deianira, fearing that he might fall in love with someone else, because why not add that level of melodrama to the mix, decided to take matters into her own hands. She thought she could win his love back by giving him a special gift. A tunic soaked in the blood of Nessus, a centaur whom Hercules had previously shot with an arrow, because that's a totally normal thing to do. The blood was supposed to make him more affectionate, but, surprise, it didn't. Instead, it was a poisoned shirt that slowly and painfully killed him. So Hercules, who had defeated lions, hydras, and entire armies, was undone by a shirt. But that's how it goes when you're Hercules. Every monumental victory is followed by a complete and utter personal disaster. Now, if we take a step back and look at the overarching theme of Hercules' love life, it becomes clear that the ancient Greeks had an interesting definition of romance. It was less about candlelit dinners and more about, hey, let's get tangled up in some divine mess and see who survives. In fact, the only constant in Hercules' love life was that someone would die, either by his own hand or some entirely preventable accident. All of this drama, this trauma, this eternal inability to just be happy, was the result of the same thing that always caused trouble for him: the gods. Every romantic misstep, every misguided decision, every ill-fated spouse was part of a much larger narrative where Hercules was eternally out of control. And yet, he somehow never learned. It was a cycle of meet cute, fall in love, someone dies horribly, followed by some overly optimistic attempt at redemption. It would be almost tragic if it weren't so absurdly funny. It's like the gods set him up to fail, and he dutifully fell into every trap, trying to be the hero everyone wanted, but failing to grasp the fact that maybe, just maybe, being a hero doesn't mean you have to be the perfect husband. But in Greek mythology, nobody gets to be happy for long. Hercules' life was not just defined by his 12 labours or his spectacularly unfortunate romantic escapades. Oh no, there were plenty of side quests along the way, each more catastrophic than the last. If you thought Hercules was the kind of hero who simply checked off tasks and called it a day, you'd be wrong. Hercules' real talent lay in causing chaos, frequently without any prompting at all. While some heroes built their reputations by performing noble deeds, Hercules' fame grew from an entirely different form of heroic activity. mostly killing things, breaking things, and being a general nuisance to everyone around him. It's a bit like being the guy at the office who doesn't do his job, but is somehow always promoted for being memorable. One of the key features of Hercules' fame was his remarkable ability to overcompensate, and not just with excessive violence. He managed to get himself into trouble by doing what he did best: making enemies, breaking things, and solving absolutely none of his problems with anything remotely resembling diplomacy or restraint. Consider the time he wrestled with a river god, for instance. Most people, when faced with a body of water, would either navigate around it, swim through it, or wait for the current to calm down. But not Hercules. The river god, Hercules, apparently wasn't having enough fun, so Hercules, naturally, decided to wrestle him. Imagine, if you will, a battle between a man and a river. It wasn't exactly a fair fight. Rivers are hard to pin down, but Hercules, undeterred, won by snapping the river god's horn off, as one does when you find yourself involved in unnecessary violence on a regular basis. This was a typical Hercules move, the need to prove his strength in ways that were completely impractical and unlikely to benefit anyone. Then there were the times when he went on rampages for no particular reason other than his mood. Take, for example, his time sacking cities. It was not a simple matter of laying siege, having a proper battle, and taking the city by military strategy. Oh no, Hercules was the kind of guy who took a rather direct approach to sacking cities. If he didn't like you, he didn't bother with diplomacy. He would show up, defeat the local population in a couple of hours, and then leave. Because why not? He didn't even need a reason. The Greek city-states had, for some reason, decided that Hercules was the guy to call when things needed to be destroyed quickly and violently. By the end of it, he had such an extensive record of ransacked cities that it was clear. Hercules didn't need a contract for work. He just needed a mood swing. And he got paid in glory, which of course worked wonders for his reputation. But the violence wasn't just restricted to physical combat. Sometimes Hercules just killed people because they had mildly annoyed him. This is, in fact, one of the things that made him so memorable. No need for deep philosophical questions, moral dilemmas, or diplomacy. If someone crossed Hercules in even the slightest way, they might find themselves on the receiving end of his trademark, "I'm stronger than you and I'm bored" approach to problem solving. Take, for example, the murder of his music teacher, Linus. Now, it's not clear whether Linus was a particularly bad teacher or if Hercules was just having an off day. Perhaps Linus had the audacity to give him a bad grade, or maybe he scolded Hercules for not learning music theory. Whatever the case, Hercules didn't take too kindly to criticism. The result? He killed Linus with a lyre. One moment, Hercules was probably trying to learn how to play chopsticks on his lyre, and the next, his teacher was dead. This is what happens when your emotional intelligence is not on par with your physical strength. And yet, somehow, this act of murder didn't stop him from continuing his hero's journey, because the ancient Greek justice system was, as we all know, thriving. For the gods, Hercules wasn't exactly their favourite demigod. He was more of a project, like a destructive intern who could bench press the entire office, but had no concept of boundaries or appropriate behaviour. In fact, it's not just mortals that Hercules clashed with, it was the gods too. He was their problem child, and every time something went wrong, Zeus and company were quick to blame him, though it was, of course, their own fault for granting him such ridiculous amounts of strength. It wasn't like anyone sat him down and said, "Hey Hercules, maybe let's dial it back a bit. The whole smashing people with musical instruments thing might not be the best way to make friends." No, the gods simply watched as their demigod offspring went on rampages, breaking everything in sight and causing far more chaos than was really necessary, all while somehow managing to make it look like he was the hero. It's almost as if the gods were just standing on the sidelines, occasionally throwing him a task and watching to see how he'd explode next. This brings us to another one of his charming qualities: a lack of impulse control. If there was ever a demigod whose approach to life could be summed up by "I want it, I take it," it was Hercules. If he wanted something, he took it, and he usually left a trail of destruction behind him. Take the time he had an altercation with the king of Thrace, Eurytus. The king had promised Hercules his daughter's hand in marriage, but when he went back on his word, Hercules didn't negotiate or have a civil conversation. No, he decided to murder the entire royal family instead. The logic, of course, was impeccable. You didn't keep your word, so I'll just kill everyone. The king's household? Gone. His reputation as a hero? Stronger than ever. Sure, he didn't get the marriage, but hey, he got a lot of attention for his actions. As an ancient Greek hero, that's basically the same thing as winning an award. Despite all the wanton violence, destruction, and lack of common sense, Hercules continued to gain fame. And not just any kind of fame, he gained divine fame. And much like any modern celebrity who's famous for absolutely no reason other than being famous, Hercules found himself at the top of the food chain, simply because the gods had given him everything except a moral compass. The more cities he destroyed, the more monsters he killed, the more impromptu wars he started, the more he earned his place in mythological history. It wasn't his wisdom, leadership, or diplomacy that made him famous. It was the fact that he could punch through a mountain if he felt like it, and that his life was a never-ending series of actions that defied any attempt at logical narrative structure. As his reputation grew, so did his legend, always marked by absurd acts of violence, general immaturity, and an undeniable need to show the world just how strong he really was. It wasn't a journey of growth. It wasn't a tale of learning from mistakes. No, this was a story of Hercules being Hercules, and everyone just having to deal with it. Hercules' life ended exactly how one might expect a life of mythological overexertion, divine interference, and questionable fashion sense to end: in agony, fire, and poorly thought out textile choices. Because after a lifetime of battling hydras, lions, jealous goddesses, centaurs, and emotional regulation, it wasn't war or monsters that killed him. It was a poisoned shirt. That's right, not a mighty blade, not an epic betrayal, not the gods striking him down in some operatic explosion of thunder. Just a shirt. A particularly vengeful and venomous shirt, to be fair, but still a shirt. Hercules, son of Zeus, the strongest man in all of Greece, was ultimately undone by couture. The disaster began with Deianira, one of Hercules' less successful relationship choices, and the bar for that was low. At some point during their romantic saga, which had already included a river god duel, a centaur kidnapping attempt, and some very poor trust exercises, Deianira became suspicious of Hercules' wandering affections. In a move that combined bad science with worse advice, she remembered that a dying centaur, Nessus, had once told her his blood would act as a love potion. Just apply it to a garment, he claimed, and voila, eternal devotion. Now, the obvious red flags here are numerous. First, the source, a centaur who had just tried to kidnap her. Second, the context. He was actively bleeding out when he gave this little beauty tip. Third, and most importantly, no one in Greek mythology has ever benefited from taking advice from someone who is dying. But Deianira, in a moment of lethal optimism, soaked a tunic in Nessus' blood and sent it off to Hercules as a romantic gesture. Ancient Greece, where sending your husband poisoned clothing was basically the hallmark equivalent of thinking of you. Hercules, not one for intuition or reading gift tags, put on the tunic and very quickly realised that it did not, in fact, contain love magic. It contained horrible, soul-melting poison. As the toxic ichor fused with his skin, Hercules began to burn alive, but not in the dramatic lightning bolt of Zeus sort of way. No, this was a slow, awkward, excruciating collapse into literal meltdown. And, like any man faced with unremitting agony and a complete lack of emotional processing tools, Hercules decided the best course of action was to build a funeral pyre, climb on top, and try to cremate himself. Which was only marginally better than his original idea: continue wearing the shirt and hope it gets better. So there he was, on a mountain, attempting self-immolation while everyone else stood around, refusing to light the fire, because understandably, setting Hercules on fire was a dicey career move. Eventually a man named Philoctetes, either brave or pathologically uninformed, struck the match. Hercules burned, his mortal parts dissolved, and what was left, because apparently there's always something left, floated on up to Olympus. And this is where things take a hard left turn into divine PR. Zeus, who had previously spent most of Hercules' life either watching from afar or hiding behind a thundercloud during Hera's vendettas, suddenly decided it was time to intervene. Not to stop the poisoning, of course, or the shirt melting, or the fire. No, he stepped in after the fact to reward his son's smoking corpse with full god status. Because nothing says promotion like accidentally killing your wife and children, committing heroic atrocities, and spontaneously combusting in a mountaintop funeral barbecue. Thus began Hercules' apotheosis, a fancy term for congratulations on surviving life, please enjoy immortality. He ascended to Olympus, joined the divine elite, and was welcomed as a full-fledged god. Hera, who had spent decades orchestrating his personal hell, reportedly made peace with him, which may have involved some serious celestial HR mediation and a non-disclosure agreement. They even married him off to Hebe, the goddess of youth, which feels like an Olympian way of saying, let's pretend none of that ever happened. But of course something had happened, many somethings, an entire lifetime of blood, madness, impulsive violence, poorly chosen lovers, and shirt-related fatalities. And yet, what endured wasn't the carnage, but the brand. Hercules was no longer just a tragic, muscle-bound footnote in the world's most dysfunctional family tree. He was now an icon, a brand, a mythological poster boy for strength, perseverance, and doing the thing, no matter how catastrophically ill-advised. Temples went up, cults formed, coins were minted with his face. People prayed to him for strength, for courage, for the ability to wrestle metaphorical and occasionally literal beasts in their own lives. The ancient Greeks, in what can only be described as an aggressive act of historical whitewashing, sanitized his story until he resembled a noble champion who suffered nobly and triumphed nobly and only murdered a few people occasionally. Gone were the musical homicides and centaur slaughtering sprees. What remained was a clean-cut demigod who had conquered adversity, which in ancient myth was code for survived long enough to be carved into marble. Of course, this mythological makeover only escalated over time. The Romans, never ones to miss a branding opportunity, absorbed Hercules into their own pantheon and gave him even more temples, more statues, and possibly even a bath product endorsement if frescoes are to be believed. He became a symbol of imperial strength, a patron of athletes. A man so strong and so virile, he could beat anything into submission, including the actual laws of mortality. Fast forward a couple thousand years, and pop culture picked up where mythology left off, trimming off the rough edges and rounding him out into something palatable for the modern audience. Ancient Hercules, psychologically tormented killer who periodically committed mass murder when sleep deprived. Modern Hercules, big guy with a charming smile who saves kittens and flirts with goddesses. The bloody parts, the madness, the shirt-melting death. Conveniently forgotten. Apparently those details don't test well with kids. He's been portrayed as everything from a jovial strongman to a well-meaning doofus. Disney gave us a clean-shaven, wide-eyed teenage heartthrob version who had a flying horse and a gospel chorus. That Hercules wouldn't last 5 seconds in an actual myth, but he sure could move merchandise. Meanwhile, comic books, action films, and fitness supplements continue to invoke his name as shorthand for strength, masculinity, and an incredibly selective memory, because nothing screams hero like being repackaged for protein powder ads. Channel your inner Hercules, the slogans cry, conveniently leaving out the part where your inner Hercules might strangle a music teacher, kill your children in a frenzy, and set yourself on fire. Minor details. And so, Hercules' afterlife has turned out to be far more successful, and significantly more coherent than his mortal existence. As a god, he gets worshipped. As a brand, he sells. As a myth, he endures. It's not so much that people forgot what he actually did. It's more that they chose to remember the parts that made them feel strong, empowered, and very definitely not legally liable. Ancient Greece might have invented the heroic narrative, but it was the modern world that figured out how to market it. So what do we make of Hercules in the end? He was a man too strong for his own good, raised by mortals, haunted by gods, and ultimately consumed, literally and figuratively, by the contradictions of his myth. He was a killer, a hero, a god, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of emotional repression and toxic masculinity. He was beloved, feared, worshipped, and reinvented so many times that no one really remembers who he was anymore. Which, come to think of it, is the ultimate mythological victory, to be remembered forever, even if inaccurately, and turned into something that fits comfortably on a lunchbox. Because in the end, Hercules didn't just achieve immortality, he achieved relevance. And that's something even the gods have trouble pulling off.